Verath Dunn's mornings were cold in the way that suggested the planet took the cold personally. Not the neutral cold of temperature, but the cold of a world that had noted your presence and found it presumptuous. Kale Adren had been receiving this opinion for 7 years, and had developed, across those 7 years, the relationship with it that you developed with any persistent hostility you could not change, and had decided to outlast, a kind of flat, functional coexistence that was not warmth, and was not acceptance, and was sufficient. He was doing the perimeter check on the Eastern Water Reclamation Array, a morning routine so embedded in his practice that his hands performed it while his mind was elsewhere, checking pressure readings and seal integrity with the automatic precision of someone for whom attention and routine had merged into a single process, when the rockslide debris at the dry riverbed's northern edge produced, upon closer inspection, a shape that was not geological. He stopped. He looked at the shape with the quality of attention that distinguishes a surveyor from a person who merely walks through landscapes, the specific, trained recognition of a thing that does not fit its context. The shape was partially buried. The shape was the approximate size and configuration of a person. The shape was, when he crouched next to it and checked with the environmental scanner, he carried on perimeter checks because Verath Dunn had taught him that carrying things was better than needing them, alive in the technical sense. He got her out of the rockslide with the practical efficiency of someone who has performed extractions before under worse conditions, and who has learned that efficiency and care are not incompatible. The debris came away in the order that produced the least additional structural disturbance. He worked for 40 minutes. The cold had opinions about this too. She was young. His xenobiological database confirmed Vithrani physiology within the first scan. The long, tapered ears, partially visible under the debris, the bone structure, the specific coloring that the database associated with Vithrani populations in the outer systems. The database also contained the Accord's documented note on the Vithrani practice of discarding members, whose biological assessment placed them below the civilization's contribution threshold, which Kale read with the flat, unsurprised expression of someone who has spent enough time at the edges of space to have stopped being surprised by the things that civilizations do to their own members in the name of the civilization's continuation. She had no survival equipment. She had no communication device. She had the clothing she was wearing, which was not adequate for Verath Dunn, and a small object in her left hand that she was holding with the grip of someone who had decided, in whatever state preceded unconsciousness, that this was the thing worth keeping. He did not take it from her. Whatever it was hers, and the keeping of it was the last decision she had made before the rockslide, and he respected last decisions. He got her back to the structure. He got the field medicine kit. He did what the kit and his training, and 7 years of keeping himself operational on a hostile frontier planet, allowed him to do, which was more than nothing and less than what a medical facility could have offered. And he made the calculation that more than nothing was what was available, and was therefore what would have to be sufficient. She did not regain consciousness for 3 days. He kept her alive across 3 days with the methodical attention of someone who has decided that a problem is worth solving and is going to solve it with the tools available, which is not a heroic quality and is more useful than heroism in most situations. He slept in 4-hour intervals. He maintained the water reclamation array on a modified schedule. He checked her vital signs with the scanner every 2 hours and noted the readings in his survey log because noting things was how he kept his relationship with problems honest. Because the numbers on a screen were harder to manage with wishful thinking than the numbers in your head. On the 4th morning, the vital signs had moved from technically alive to something more committed, and on the 4th afternoon she opened her eyes. They were a color he didn't have a name for, not in standard, not in the limited Vithrani vocabulary he had from the database. Somewhere between the color of deep water and the color of a sky that hasn't decided what it's going to do yet. She looked at the ceiling of his structure for a moment, with the expression of someone receiving information about their environment and processing it without yet deciding what the information means. Then she looked at him. "Why?" she said. The translation collar rendered it as a single standard syllable, flat and genuine, carrying in its simplicity the full weight of the question, which was not "Why did you help me?" and was not "Why am I still alive?" and was both of those and also the larger question underneath both of them, which was why to any of this at all. Kale looked at her across the 3 days he had spent keeping her alive, and the 40 minutes he had spent getting her out of the rockslide, and the 7 years he had spent on Varathdown, which had not been kind to him, and which he had outlasted through the same quality of flat, functional stubbornness he was currently applying to her situation. He thought about the honest answer to why, which was not simple, and he thought about the dishonest answer, which was. "You were there," he said, which was both simpler than the honest answer, and if you followed it to where it went, the honest answer. She looked at him for a long moment with those unnameable eyes. Then she looked at the ceiling again with the expression of someone who has received an answer and is determining where to file it. She did not say anything else that day. He did not push. Varathdown had taught him that things which were not ready did not become ready faster for being pushed, and that patience was not the absence of action but a specific form of it. Her name was Sale. She gave it on the 6th day, in the tentative way of someone testing whether a thing offered will be used or stored, whether the name will be received as information or as a handle. He used it simply, the first chance he had, without weight or significance, because names were what you called people, and she was a person, and that was the whole of it. Her ears, which had been in the slightly backward position he was already learning to associate with wariness, moved fractionally forward. He noted this and did not comment on it, because commenting on it would have made it a thing rather than letting it be what it was. She told him about the assessment in pieces, across the following weeks, in the way that people tell things that have been the central fact of their existence for long enough to become structurally load-bearing, carefully, in the order that allows the weight to be distributed rather than arriving all at once. The Vithrani genetic assessment was conducted at 17, at the transition point between developmental and contributory classification. It measured what the Vithrani had decided over millennia were the relevant biological markers, psychic integration, social resonance, the specific genetic indicators that predicted a member's capacity to contribute to the civilization's functioning. It was not cruel in the Vithrani experience of the process. It was simply accurate in the way that a measuring instrument is accurate. It measured what it was designed to measure and reported the result without editorial. Sale's result had placed her below the threshold. Below the threshold, she was assessed as a resource expenditure that the civilization did not find viable to continue. The practice was so old that the Vithrani did not experience it as a decision. They experienced it as a conclusion. She described this with the flat, precise delivery of someone who has processed a thing to the point where processing no longer produces feeling. Cale listened with the quality of attention he gave to things that mattered and did not offer her pity, because pity was not the thing a person needed when they had been told their value by an authority, and the telling had been structural enough to feel like truth. Pity confirmed the smallness. He offered her instead the water reclamation array. "The eastern pressure valve needs calibration every 3rd day," he said, on the morning of the 2nd week, when she was mobile and stable and clearly in need of something to do with her hands and her attention. "The schedule is in the survey log. The calibration tool is on the 2nd shelf." She looked at him. "You want me to calibrate the pressure valve?" "The valve needs calibrating," he said. "You need something to do, the needs coincide." She calibrated the pressure valve with the focused, slightly too careful attention of someone who has been handed a responsibility and is not going to be the one who fails it. She got it right on the 1st attempt. She got it right on the 2nd, which was 3 days later, with 15% less time than the 1st. Cale noted this in the survey log and said nothing, because noting and saying were different things, and the noting was for him, and the saying was not needed. Varathdown was not a kind teacher. It was cold and specific, and required everything you had, and occasionally required more than that, which was when it was teaching you what your actual limits were rather than what you thought they were. Sale met it with the focused intensity of someone for whom learning was no longer performance, and had become, entirely, survival, which was a different quality of engagement, the way that hunger and appetite were different qualities of wanting food. She wanted to learn the water reclamation system not because it would demonstrate her value to an assessment, but because not knowing it meant death. And death was the thing that had been decided for her, and that she was, with a constancy that Cale found himself watching with the specific quality of attention he usually reserved for things that did not fit his expectations, declining. She was not easy. She had the specific difficulty of someone who had been told their worth by an authority so structural it felt like physics, and whose relationship with her own capacity was therefore conducted through a framework of sufficiency that moved. Every time she met a standard, the standard moved, not because she was not meeting it, but because the part of her that had been assessed as insufficient was watching and adjusting the threshold to stay out of reach. Cale recognized this. He did not address it directly, because he had learned, in 7 years of living alone with his own version of this, that the framework did not respond to frontal engagement. He addressed it sideways. He assigned her problems that were at the edge of her current ability, and did not mention when she solved them. He noted the solutions in the survey log, and occasionally read the log aloud while she was in the room, and did not comment when she heard her own name in the list of things that had worked. The year passed. The second year began with Sale knowing the water reclamation system completely, and the weather patterns partially, and the geology of the immediate area in enough detail to have identified a secondary water source that Cale had surveyed and noted, and not pursued, because he had enough water and not enough time. She pursued it. She spent 3 weeks on the project in the margins of her other responsibilities, and on the 22nd day she redirected the secondary drainage into the dry riverbed east of the perimeter, which began, within a week, to have water in it. Cale stood at the perimeter and looked at the water in the riverbed, and thought about the girl he had found buried in the debris at its edge, and did not say anything about this, because there was nothing to say that the water itself didn't say better. The biological changes began in year 4. They were not dramatic at onset. They were the kind of change that is visible only in retrospect, which was consistent with the way Verath Dunn produced things, which was through accumulation rather than event. Sale's physical recovery from Verath Dunn's demands became faster. Then it became fast. Then it became a quality that did not fit the category of fast, because fast implied a rate relative to a baseline, and the baseline was no longer applicable. In year 4, she was out in weather that Cale sheltered from, not because she was careless, but because the weather that required him to shelter did not require her to shelter anymore. In year 4, she was running the perimeter check in the dark in a quarter of the time it took him in daylight, not because she had a light source he didn't have, but because she was navigating by something that was not light. In year 4, the survey scanner that he used to check her vital signs on the 4th day, which he still ran occasionally. The professional habit of a former environmental surveyor who noted things, returned readings that required him to consult the Accord's xenobiological database, and the database to consult its theoretical appendices, and the theoretical appendices to note that the readings were outside the standard parameters for any documented Vithrani biological profile, and that this might indicate sensor malfunction. The sensor was not malfunctioning. He said nothing to her about the readings. He had learned, in 5 years of watching Sale conduct her relationship with her own capacity through the moving threshold framework, that the way to address the framework was not to point at the capacity. The capacity was doing what capacities do when they are not being measured for an assessment. It was simply being what it was, and what it was not what the Vithrani assessment had predicted. In year 5, she ran 12 kilometers in the dark during a storm to reach the secondary water reclamation array. He knew the array's pressure readings had been irregular for 2 days, and had been planning to address it in the morning, which the morning would have been too late for. She had read the same pressure readings, made the same determination, and acted on it in the time it had taken him to fall asleep. She came back through the storm and through the door with the array's broken component in her hand and water running off her ears, and the composed, unremarkable quality of someone who has done a thing and is reporting its completion. "The backup heating element is in the second cabinet," he said. She took it. She knew where the second cabinet was. She had known for 3 years. He sat in the main room and listened to her install the heating element with the efficient, certain movements of someone for whom the structure systems were not external knowledge, but internal landscape, and thought about the survey scanner's readings and the Accord's xenobiological database's theoretical appendices and the specific quality of the past 5 years, which had been the accumulation of a thing he did not have a name for yet. In year 6, the Vithrani Senate's research vessel entered Verath Dunn's orbital space, and Cale's external communication array registered the contact request with the specific tone it used for official transmissions, which he had not heard in 7 years, and which sounded, in the structure's main room on a cold morning, like a door opening onto something that the structure's walls had been successfully keeping outside until now. He accepted the transmission. The Vithrani Senate's scientific liaison explained, in the careful language of official inquiry, that their monitoring network had received biosignature data from Verathdunn's automated survey array that their analysts had been unable to classify, and that the data had been traced to a point source in his survey zone, and that they were requesting permission to conduct an on-surface assessment. Kale looked at the communication panel for a moment. He thought about the girl in the dry riverbed and the 6 years of accumulation and the survey scanner's readings and the unnameable color of her eyes. He thought about the Accord's cultural database entry on the Vithrani practice of discarding non-contributory members. "I'll pass the request on," he said, "to the relevant party." He found Sale at the secondary water reclamation array, where she was performing the calibration that she performed every third day with the same focused precision she had applied to the first calibration in year 1, which was not the same precision at all, but occupied the same posture. He told her about the transmission. He told her about the research vessel in orbit. He told her what the scientific liaison had said about the biosignature data and what the fact of the vessel meant and who was on it. She did not respond immediately. She finished the calibration. She set the tool on the second shelf. She turned and looked at him with the eyes that he had been looking at for 6 years and still did not have a name for the color of, and he looked back at her with the quality of attention he had been developing for 7 years before she arrived, and that had become, in 6 years of her, something that he was not examining too closely. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at the calibration tool on the shelf. She looked at the eastern perimeter where the dry riverbed had water in it now. She looked at the structure, which was salvage and survey equipment, and the specific stubbornness of someone who had decided that if they were going to be alone, they were going to be alone properly, and which had not been alone in 6 years. "I want to meet them at the perimeter," she said, "not at the door." He nodded. "I'll make the approach coordinates available." "Kale," he stopped. She looked at him with the direct, unmanaged attention that was how she looked at things she was not going to perform looking at. "Whatever they say about what I am, whatever the readings are." She paused with the precision of someone choosing the right words from a language that does not always have the right words. "You already knew." He looked at her. He thought about the why, which he had answered with "you were there," which was both simpler and more complete than the honest answer. And he thought about the honest answer, which was that he had known. In the way that you know things that you cannot measure. In the specific, felt certainty of a person who had been applying the wrong instruments to his own life for 7 years before she arrived. And who recognized the wrong instruments because he knew what the right thing felt like. "You made it easier to figure out," he said, which was honest, and which was also the closest he was going to come to the thing he was not examining too closely. And she received it with the slight forward movement of her ears that meant something had been heard rather than merely processed. The Vithrani Senate's senior representative was a woman named Verse, whose bearing communicated that she had been official for long enough that officialness had become structural rather than performed, and whose long ears were in the managed position of someone conducting inquiry of consequence and maintaining its appropriate register. She came with a scientific team of 4 and a diplomatic aide, and the specific quality of institutional attention that arrives when an organization has found something it did not know existed and is determining what it means for the organization. They did not make it to the structure. Sale met them at the perimeter, as she had said she would, not aggressively, not with the theater of a return that demands to be witnessed, but simply there, in the 12-kilometer zone that she had spent 6 years learning in the complete and specific way of someone for whom the learning was survival. She stood at the perimeter with the composed, unhurried quality of someone who is in their place, which was the most significant quality she could have had in that moment, because the Vithrani Senate had been prepared for someone diminished or damaged or angry, and had not been prepared for someone who was simply, entirely, home. Verse looked at her with the scientific team's scanning equipment active, and the results visible on her display, and the expression of someone whose framework is encountering a fact it cannot contain. The biosignature data had been correct. The readings were not classifiable under any existing Vithrani biological profile. They were Vithrani in origin, and they were not Vithrani in extent, and the specific pathway they indicated was one that the Vithrani Senate scientists would spend the next 3 years attempting to understand, and would eventually document under a classification that required the creation of a new category. "You are Sale," Verse said, not a question, a confirmation of a data point. "Yes," Sale said, "the assessment conducted at your 17th year was accurate," Sale said, "for what it measured." She looked at Verse with the eyes that did not have a color name. It did not measure everything. Vers looked at her display. She looked at the biosignature readings. She looked at Sale. "What happened to you?" She said, which was not the official question and was the real one. "Verath done," Sale said, "and time, and someone who did not apply your measurements." The negotiation that followed was not simple. The Vithrani Senate had institutional interests in the biological pathway that Sale represented, which were scientific and political, and underneath both of those, the specific interest of an organization that has discovered a flaw in its foundational assessment system and is determining how to understand that discovery. The Accord's diplomatic division, which had been monitoring the research vessel's entry into Accord-adjacent space and had dispatched an observer, had interests in the political implications of a discarded Vithrani member, presenting a biological profile that the Vithrani Senate was now formally pursuing. The interested parties of the wider galaxy, who had been receiving the transmitted summaries of the Senate's scientific findings through the standard monitoring network, had interests that ranged from the academic to the strategic. Sale navigated all of this with the composed precision of someone who had spent 6 years learning that the most important thing in any environment was to understand it completely, which included understanding the people moving through it. She answered the scientific questions. She engaged with the diplomatic framework. She was not vengeful, which confounded Vers, who had prepared for various responses and had frameworks for each of them, and who found that the frameworks did not apply to someone whose primary request was not about herself. "I have one condition," Sale said in the formal session, with the Vithrani Senate's representatives and the Accord's observer and the scientific team all present. "Non-negotiable." Vers looked at her, stated. "The structure at the Survey Zone Center," Sale said. "The man who lives there. Whatever the Senate decides about my biological classification, whatever the Accord decides about the diplomatic implications, whatever the interested parties of the galaxy decide about what I represent, none of it enters his 12-kilometer zone in a form that changes his life without his consent. He is not a resource. He is not an asset. He is the reason I am here to be interesting to you, and his life has more value than the discussion you are having about mine." The room was quiet in the way of rooms that have received a statement they did not anticipate. Vers looked at her for a long moment. "What does he mean to you?" she said, which was again not the official question. Sale looked at her with the fully forward ears of someone who does not perform true things and does not manage them, and simply, when asked, says them. "Everything that the assessment said I wasn't," she said. Vers was quiet with this for a moment that was not official. She was a woman who had spent 30 years applying Vithrani assessment frameworks to the world, and had found, for the first time in 30 years, a data point that the frameworks did not account for, not because the data point was wrong, but because the frameworks had been measuring the wrong thing, and the wrong thing had been foundational long enough that the correction required not an adjustment but a reconstruction. "The condition is accepted," she said. The formal documentation took 3 days. The scientific team's assessment took a week. The Accord's observer filed a report that generated 4 working groups and a subcommittee that would meet for the next several months and produce a framework document that nobody was entirely satisfied with, and that was, in that way, probably accurate. The Vithrani Senate began the process of reviewing the assessment protocol, which was described in official communication as a comprehensive evaluation, and which was, in the plainer language of what was happening, an organization confronting the possibility that its most foundational practice had been wrong. Sale left the formal proceedings each evening and walked back to the 12-kilometer zone. Because the proceedings ended in the evening and the perimeter check was a morning task, and there was therefore no operational reason for the walks, and she made them anyway. On the 3rd evening, Kale was at the eastern perimeter when she came back across it. The dry riverbed had water in it, moving in the way of water that has found its channel, and is now simply doing what water does, which is move through the space it has been given without requiring the space to be anything other than what it is. He looked at her coming across the perimeter with the quality of attention he had been developing for 6 years, and that had become, in 6 years, the thing he was not examining too closely, which was the same thing as not examining closely and the opposite of it, because not examining closely meant he had made a choice about where to keep it rather than whether to have it. "How did it go?" he said. "They accepted the condition," she said. He nodded. He had not doubted this, which was information about what he thought she was capable of, and she registered it as she registered all things he did not say in the slight forward movement of her ears, the receiving rather than merely hearing. "The Senate scientific team wants a follow-up assessment," she said. "In 3 months. Will you go?" She looked at the water in the riverbed. She looked at the structure behind him, which was salvage and survey equipment, and 7 years of someone's stubbornness, and 6 years of hers. She looked at him with the eyes that had a color he had spent 6 years not finding a name for, and had concluded did not have one in the languages he knew. "Yes," she said, "and I'll come back." He looked at the water. He thought about the why, which she had asked him on the 4th day, and which he had answered with "you were there." And he thought about what the honest answer had always been, which was the answer that lived in the category of things he was not examining too closely. He examined it now because 6 years was long enough, and she was standing at the perimeter she had walked back across every evening for 3 days, and the riverbed had water in it. "Good," he said. "The eastern valve needs calibrating." Her ears moved, fully, unhurried, to the position he had been learning for 6 years, and knew now as the one she wore when she had received something she had not been certain she was going to receive, and found that it was worth the 6 years of waiting for the right moment to receive it. "I know," she said. "I'll do it in the morning." Varath evening cold settled around them with its usual personal quality, the cold of a world that had opinions about your presence, and had been having them for 7 years about his and 6 about hers, and had not, in 13 accumulated years of opinions, managed to produce the outcome it appeared to prefer. They stood at the perimeter in the cold and looked at the water in the riverbed, and the galaxy assembled its opinion of both of them somewhere in the distance, and neither of them was in any hurry to receive it, because receiving it would require leaving the perimeter, and the perimeter was where they were, and being where you were was, Varath had taught them both, the whole of survival, and also, it turned out, the whole of something else that was larger than survival and did not yet have a name that fit. But that would, in time, in the way of all things built from accumulation rather than event, find one.